About 26 years ago, I lived with my mom and stepdad in a small community known as Juniper Woods Ranch, which sat just outside of a small town in Arizona. Juniper Woods Ranch got its name from the juniper tree which enveloped the landscape of the community. The roads are unpaved and, in certain spots, rough, and when it rained it was extremely hard to get in or out of because of the red clay. Anyways, one day my friend Marilyn, who lived about 2 miles further up from where we lived, came over and asked me if I wanted to spend the weekend with her at her place, and asked me if I wanted to go to Jerome with her the next day. I said yes, that sounds like fun. So I packed up some things and we got into her truck and drove off towards her house. Now the further you go to get to Juniper Woods, the more isolated and dense the population becomes. And now you're more surrounded by nothing but trees and silence. We got to her house and settled in, and we began to talk about different things that girls talk about. Later that evening, as she was cooking dinner, I decided I would go and explore around her property, just enjoy the quiet and the beauty of my surroundings. But the whole time I was there, the air felt heavy, and always felt like something was watching me. I just felt completely uneasy. Well, anyways, we eat dinner and she asked me if I wanted to go watch a movie, and I said sure thing. So she asked me if I have ever seen the movie The Howling. I told her I think once, and she said great, that's the movie we're watching. And I go cool. She puts the movie in and processes as she goes to the kitchen to make us some popcorn and something to drink. When she returned, she started the movie and we started watching it. And now I know why I only watched it once. Just something about The Howling that unnerves me and literally scares me to death. I don't know, maybe it's the way it invokes almost raw and pure fear inside of me. I swear, to this day, I won't watch it, and the nightmares. Well anyways, after the movie was over, she said we need to go to sleep. We've got a long and busy day tomorrow, and I said okay, cool. And we said goodnight, and she went off to her room as I laid there on the couch. Her house at the time had 4 large windows, and they did not have curtains on them. And that night the moon hung high in the sky, letting in just enough light to illuminate the living room. I don't know how long I laid there before I heard it. All of a sudden I heard this low guttural growl and heavy breathing, and I laid there listening, thinking to myself, okay, you just watched a horror movie, and your mind is playing tricks on you. And I need to stop scaring myself, so I got comfortable again, and the noise came again, and for whatever reason I got the courage to look up from under my covers. And I wish to God that I hadn't. Because standing not but a few feet away was something very large, hairy, and staring at me with human-like eyes, and with the intensity of anger. I quickly threw the covers back over my head and laid there frozen, and shaking badly, and thinking at any time this creature was going to attack me and possibly kill me. Again, I don't know how long that I was laying there, when all of a sudden it seemed like it had moved closer to me, because its breathing and growling sounded closer, and I could feel its hot breath breathing on me, and the smell was overwhelmingly nauseating, and I fought back the urge to throw up. I took my head out from under the covers, and yeah, it was closer, and I could just now make out what the creature looked like. This creature had to stand over 7 feet tall, and had a snout like a wolf, hairy, and soon to be standing on legs that shouldn't have been able to support that height level or the weight. It has long arms and razor-sharp claws at its teeth. Oh god, its teeth. Its teeth were long and sharp and yellowed and covered in drool. I tried to let out a scream, but nothing would come out. Frozen and unable to move, I just laid there staring at whatever the hell the thing was as it stared back at me. And I don't know if it was from the pure fear, but I must have passed out because the next thing I know, my friend Marilyn is waking me up and telling me that breakfast is done. And she stops and looks at me and goes, "Are you alright, hon? You don't look so good." I couldn't say anything, but what she asked me next terrified me just as much as the creature did. She asked me how I slept last night, and if I saw anything scary. I don't know if it was just my imagination running wild, or it was my friend Marilyn. Was she a skinwalker? I don't know, because I never went back and stayed the night at her house ever again. This is a story my family told me when I was growing up. We live in a rural community on the Navajo reservation. My aunt and her 2 brothers were home alone while my grandparents had left for the evening to attend a chapter house meeting. They were in the house, and like many people from the reservation, they didn't have electricity. It had been dark outside for about an hour, and my aunt and my uncles were getting ready for bed, as if someone was moving things around outside. My oldest uncle went to look out the front window and saw a figure out by the truck. This was immensely out of the ordinary because the closest neighbor was miles away. Whatever it was opened the truck door and began to dig through the personal items that my family had left in the vehicle. My aunt and uncles were frightened by the sight and knew that they should take action. They took out the rifle and all steadied themselves to hold it up. They flung open the door and aimed the gun at the dark figure. The figure turned and started to walk towards them, totally unfazed by the weapon. My uncle pulled the trigger, but nothing happened. The figure drew closer and my aunt began to smell something like a rotting corpse. It was so strong it made her gag. My uncle continued to pull the trigger with no luck, and the figure came closer and closer. Off the distance, headlights were coming up the road. My grandparents were returning. The figure looked towards the lights and started to move away and tucked itself behind a tree near the house. My oldest uncle ran toward the truck with a gun. My grandfather got out of the car and my uncle pointed to the tree. The thing was poking its head out to observe what they were doing. My grandfather ran into the house and over to the stove and grabbed a handful of ashes and rubbed over the gun and placed an ash-covered bullet in the chamber. He walked out onto the porch and fired toward the tree. Whatever that thing was didn't expect the gun to go off. The gunshot echoed and the dark figure began running. My grandma chased my aunt inside and my uncles and my grandfather went after it. There weren't many roads or paths, so as my grandfather and uncles chased after the figure, the truck was bouncing and the headlights were not fixed on one particular spot. My uncle swears that whenever the headlights would hit the figure, he saw a woman. Not only that, whoever it was running on all fours like a bear. My grandfather eventually stopped the truck as they neared the ditch that drops about 20 feet. He got out and began to yell in Navajo. My uncle says that he was yelling about a local woman. He yelled that he wasn't scared and that he knew it was her and to leave his family alone. A few days passed and there was news that the woman that my grandfather was yelling about had passed. I've always been told that if you know who the Skinwalker is, you say their name and it will kill them. My aunt's family lived in a community about 20 miles south of Gallup, New Mexico. The area is far different from where I live. My house is surrounded by desert and you really don't see trees until you move into the canyon. Bread Springs is a forested area and where our story takes place. Like many people on the reservation, my aunt's family didn't have running water or electricity. In order to have water, they would have to drive into town and haul back water in a large container. The containers are huge and easily fit in the bed of a truck. Her family would place 2 containers on a long flatbed trailer to make the best of each trip. Her family went into Gallup, filled up the containers, and went around town doing other types of business. Back then, seatbelt laws weren't so strict, and so my aunt and her siblings sat in the bed of the truck as they went around town. It began to get dark, and so the family started back home. Most roads weren't paved, and so they had to drive carefully because of the attached trailer. The lights of town faded away in the distance, and soon the vehicle was shrouded in darkness. They drove and the kids sat in the back and talked amongst themselves. That wasn't until my aunt noticed something. A figure was crouched by the farthest water container on the flatbed. The truck wasn't barreling down the road, but it was going at a speed that would be impossible for anyone to run and jump on. My aunt nudged her siblings and they all paused to look at the dark figure. They sat silently and squinted their eyes to look. It was too dark to really make anything out, and so they ignored her and continued to talk. My aunt kept her eye on the figure, and pulled hard on the sleeve of her brother when the figure began to crawl over one of the water containers. The kids all stopped and watched in horror as the figure began to move carefully over the second container. My aunt said that the figure looked like a person, however the limbs were abnormally long. These long limbs pulled its body closer to the kids. At this point they began to scream and cry. They banged on the window of the truck. At this time, the creature was reaching for the tailgate of the truck. Due to the huge commotion that was now going on in the bed of the truck, the driver slammed on the brakes. The creature hit the tailgate and fell down in between the truck and the trailer. The driver rolled down the window and asked what was going on. The kids screamed at the driver to go. They weren't sure they were safe until they saw that the trailer moved up and down, as if it ran over something large. When my aunt told me this story, I sat in belief. She told me that she was uncomfortable when it was crawling on the trailer, but true fear rang through her body when she saw its eyes. I asked her what she meant. She said they were like teddy bear eyes. I didn't quite understand what that meant until I pressed further. She said that its eyes were shiny. When you shine the light in the eyes of an animal, they reflect back. The brake lights were shining, and whatever they saw that night had eyes that glowed back. One evening my aunt was home with her siblings. Her parents had ran into town to do some errands and wouldn't be back until it was late. She lived in a pretty rural area, surrounded by a thick forest. Her house was pretty small and they had a few horses. Their horse Coral was quite a ways from their house. Each evening the kids would be sent out to tend to the horses by giving them hay and filling the water troughs. The hay bales were stacked near the barn. The bales of hay were large, each about 4 feet long and 2 feet high and about 3 feet wide. There was a stack of these large bales, maybe 30 of them. My aunt said that they didn't have a very large barn, and so they would keep the hay outside and cover it up when it rained. As they were taking the hay to the horses and filling the water troughs, my aunt heard a sound. It was a shuffling, scratching noise. The sound was amplified when all of the children stopped to listen. Where they lived, it was so quiet. They could hear the wind softly blowing the trees, but then it would be interrupted by the sound. My aunt's older brother walked around to pinpoint the sound. It was coming from behind the hay. There was a space between the hay and the barn, not very big at all. The kids all looked at something dark wedged between the bales of hay and the wall of the barn. When it moved, the body scraped against the hard surface of the barn. The kids wondered what it was. No one was sure. They figured that whatever it was harmless and went to finish their work. It started to get darker and the kids thought that they would look to see if the thing was still there. It was still wedged against the wall, but this time it wasn't moving. Suddenly it began to cry out like a cat. Meowing began to come from behind the hay. It sounded strange. It was off. Whatever was behind the hay was too large to be any sort of cat. My aunt said they got very scared because the more they listened to the noise the thing made, the more it started sounding like a person trying to mimic a cat. The kids went inside the house and locked the door. By this time it was dark. The kids were sitting in the house, not talking very much. My aunt said that her brother told them to be quiet, and he kept peeking out the window toward the barn. Suddenly, loud noises were heard. Rapid pounding was coming from above, as if someone was running on the roof. My aunt said it had to be a person, because the footsteps were so loud. She began crying and screaming as the footsteps ran back and forth. Whatever it was ran back and forth on the roof for several minutes. None of the kids were brave enough to investigate. The footsteps finally stopped. It got very quiet and the kids sat together, shaking with fear. Their attention was drawn back to the door. They heard noises coming from outside. They all huddled together, bracing themselves for the worst. The door opened and dread was immediately substituted with relief as their parents walked into the door. My aunt and her siblings told her parents what had happened and they thought that was the end of their horrifying encounter. However, as the days went on, her family would hear the footsteps on their roof at night. Whoever it was would run back and forth, even when her parents weren't home. She said that her dad would open a window and yell at whoever it was in the Navajo. He would tell it to leave his family alone, and then he would begin to pray. My aunt says that eventually the footsteps stopped, but that this was not the last encounter that she would have with skinwalkers.